Joe, let's dive into this Tour de Suisse versus the Criterium du Dauphine. Which is better for your Tour de France preparation? Before I do that, I want to say this is brought to you by Alpecin. Joe, give us the details. When are these stages and what are we looking at here? How many days? When are the races run?
So the Dauphiné starts on May the 30th. It runs for 8 stages. Then the Tour de Suisse starts on the day the Dauphiné ends and also runs for 8 stages.
Now these stage races, what's particular about them is that it looks like this year we have, of course, the Dauphiné has that one time trial in it, and I think it's around 16.4 kilometers. And the Tour of Suisse has 2 time trials in it, an opening stage, what they're calling stage 1, it's not a prologue, and this kind of mammoth mountain time trial stage that goes up to, I think, 2,000 meters and something, and then descends back down. I think it climbs 400 meters, 600 meters, and so those are some key differences in the races. You get the Dauphiné ends with those 3 Alpine summit finishes. Now, one of the key things that separate these races is that traditionally the Tour de Suisse comes later in the season, about a week later. They overlap a little bit. So the Tour riders will be looking at that race. Those guys that want to go to the Tour right off of the hills of another race maybe could pick the Tour de Suisse. The other guys that want a little bit more time to maybe taper off a bit, and then before they head to the Tour de France, which starts on June 26th in Brest this year, they could choose the Criterium du Dauphiné. Also, we have to keep in mind that the Dauphiné, it's run by the organization ASO, the same organization that runs the Tour de France, Joe, and so they both have that same distinctive yellow jersey, where the Tour de Suisse, it's of course in Switzerland, doesn't go over any of the same roads as the Tour de France would do, and so could be something that maybe the riders would prefer to race in France and run by the same in a race that's run by the same organization as the Tour de France. But it's all this stuff you have to take into consideration, Joe. What do you think is in the minds of these teams and riders when they're trying to decide which race to go to and what race you pick?
Well, if you're looking at the numbers, history says that going to the Dauphiné is a better idea because way more riders have gone to the Dauphiné and won the Tour. People like Chris Froome. When it comes to Romandie, the only one we could find in recent times is Egan Bernal in 2019, isn't it?
That's right. And you mentioned Froome. I think he, out of his 4 Tour de France victories, he's won the Dauphiné 3 times, heading on to the Tour de France where he won the overall. I think it was just in 2017 where he didn't win the Dauphiné. It was Jakob Fuglsang that had that Dauphiné title, but Froome went on to win the Tour de France regardless. And Egan Bernal there in the 2019 Tour de Suisse, and then went on to win the 2019 overall at the Tour de France. So that's something of note for these races. Another thing is that the teams have to. These teams have so many top riders these days that they have to split up the riders into the races. So that's also a factor, because you have a team that maybe has your 1-star rider. They get 2 big riders. They need to split them off into different stage races for different objectives. So we're going to dive into those teams who have the GC riders and what teams they're in for the races, because we know Tom Pidcock, who's just smashing it up at a recent World Cup over the weekend, is racing in the Tour de Suisse. Joe?
Yeah, well, Tom Pidcock raced the Albstadt Mountain Bike World Cup last weekend. He did incredibly well. Unbelievably well. What a performance. And then this weekend coming, he's going to be racing the Nova Mesto World Cup, and then straight from there he's going to be going to the Tour de Suisse, I believe. So a bit different prep to the rest of the riders, but he's having an incredible first season, so you can't put anything by him. He could do really well there. And
let's just go down some of the other names that are in the Tour de Suisse. And talking about Tom Pidcock, I do not think he's going on to race the Tour de France. What do you think of Joe? Do you think he's going to race the Tour?
It's doubtful, isn't it? I think if you've raced, your first year as a kind of an elite pro, and then you've raced the classics, then you go straight into racing mountain bike World Cups. They're incredibly intense races. You've got to switch bikes, switch the training style slightly, then back to Swiss, and then off to I guess, the biggest bike race in the world. That's a very demanding schedule for such a young rider in their first year as a full-time pro.
And if we're looking, we have Pidcock at Swiss, where Ineos puts his other star riders, Rowan Dennis, Geraint Thomas, and Richard Carapaz at the Dauphiné. So you can see they're really sending those tour guys to the Dauphiné and perhaps giving Pidcock to kind of a chance to spread his wings a little bit in a big stage race at the Tour de Suisse. Now let's look at some of those other big riders. We got home rider Mark Hirschi racing for UAE Team Emirates. Michael Woods. Now there's another scenario where you have Michael Woods racing in the Tour de Suisse while you got another guy, another name that everybody's heard of, Chris Froome, racing in the Dauphiné nearly at the same time. And we have, of course, Max Schachmann and Jakob Fuglsang racing in the Tour de Suisse. Over in the Criterium du Dauphine, we have many big star riders. As I mentioned, of course, there's Geraint Thomas, who's looking so good. We talked about him in last week's show, that this could be the year that Thomas goes on to win another Tour de France title after his 2018 Tour de France win. We have Geraint Thomas for Team Ineos. We have Julian Alaphilippe, Deceuninck Quickstep. We have Guillaume Martin for Team Cofidis, Miguel Angel Lopez, Movistar, David Gaudu, Groupama FDJ, Sepp Kuss, Steven Kruijswijk, Wout van Aert, Jumbo-Visma, as I mentioned before, Chris Froome, Nairo Quintana, KSM-Sek, and Wout Poels from Bahrain Victorious. Now, it's interesting in Team Jumbo-Visma because one name that we haven't talked about in those teams is Primoz Roglic. Now, Primoz Roglic has an interesting Tour de France lead up, and he's not racing the Tour de Suisse or the Criterium du Dauphiné. I expect that Tadej Pogačar will be down. I think for the Criterium du Dauphiné, these start lists are still developing at this point. But Primoz Roglic, the team has opted for a different lead up to the Tour de France for him. Joe, you read a little bit about this. What is that lead up and why are they doing what they're doing for Primoz?
Since Liège-Bastogne-Liège, they've decided not to race Primoz, so he's not going to race from Liège-Bastogne-Liège, which was a few weeks ago, I think, until the Tour de France. So quite a break from racing, but the idea being that he's going to be much fresher. I guess it also means there's less chance of crashing or getting any injuries during races leading up to the biggest race of the year, which is the Tour. And yeah, apparently they felt they raced him a lot last year and he'll be much fresher if he doesn't race this year before the Tour. And hopefully he'll win this time, because obviously he had that time trial last year where he lost the race to Pogačar. Yeah, now that, of course, that is fresh in his mind, fresh in everyone's mind, and that was a disaster of a day where he was up like 1 minute and lost the race by 1 minute to Pogačar, another Slovenian, on the penultimate day of the Tour de France, and the team really wants to rectify that this year and try to get the formula right. So there appears to be no right formula heading into the Tour de France. You get riders in Tour de Suisse, you got riders in the Dauphiné, and it's just kind of a preference and kind of how the teams want to manage their star riders heading in to these events. And then you get riders like Roglic who aren't even going to either of those races. He's going to be off in Tenerife doing his altitude training camp thing. And I think he has the Olympics later on too, so they're really concerned about what Roglic is doing. Where last year he had the Tour and then he came back for the Vuelta and he pulled things out of the bag in the Vuelta and that looked all right. So they apparently know what they're doing at the Jumbo-Visma. So it'll be a good one. I'm looking forward to the Dauphiné, and that is one of the races we're going to be covering live and on demand for our Canadian viewers, and of course Tour de Suisse will be live and on demand for our US, Canada, and Australian viewers, and everybody can log on to the website and of course download the Flow Sports app and watch all the content. And I'll be there on the ground at the Tour. I'll be there on the ground at the Tour de France, but also the Criterium du Dauphiné, which starts again, as Joe mentioned earlier, on May 30th.